Very good morning to you all, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this lecture. I heard a few minutes ago you are trying to communicate to each other. That's very good. I've been trying to assign co-host rights to as many as you so that you can actually help me manage the session in case we get mics that misbehave right along the way. And you know, this is very, very common. Quite often we get interruptions. So just to remind you about a few things, if you recall, let me try to share here. Where is the sharing button? All right. Last time, all right. Share, right. So last time, I think this is the third lecture, if I'm not mistaken, in the series of what constitutes a research problem, right? I think many of us, we took this area for granted that any one of us can easily write a statement of the problem, right? But in the actual sense, there are many things that go into it, right? So that is where we started about 3 weeks ago, right? We went through all of those aspects that are very important, right? And the scientific foundations, right? The characteristics, the scholarly problems, right? What should actually constitute the scholarly problems, right? We went into essential elements, right, and sources of knowledge, if you recall very well, right? I don't have to really go into this.
I went through like this man.
Can someone help me deal with Mike that is misbehaving? Right, so these are issues that we looked at last time, and we did cover those aspects. So I do not have to.
Prof, you're muted.
Prof, you are muted. We can't hear you.
But Prof can't hear you either since he's muted. So we type.
What you are saying is correct. Whenever I unmute myself, someone mutes me. Right. I hope now I don't know. Maybe I should dismiss you people as co-hosts because you keep on muting me. Right. Can you now behave and stop muting me, please? You are doing it every minute and every second. I try to speak, you mute me. Just mute the rest. I think you can see my name there and you can always tell who is speaking. So do not mute anybody. And if someone is also given permission to speak, please do not mute that person. Right. I hope you will behave. Right. This has just happened in this session. It has not been happening well, and it creates some bit of interruption. I hope you heard what I said. I do not have to repeat those things, right? Otherwise, we are going to waste a lot of time. And having said that, I think we stopped at a time when we were looking at what we call research problems and the history of scientific progress, right? And again, this is something that we covered, ladies and gentlemen, right? I just gave, I think, an overview, right, of this. And the reason why I gave it to you is because I want you to know that all the knowledge that you have accumulated over time, right, either through reading the various books and journal articles and the facilitation that you have received from your professors, right? And also the supervisory guidance given by your doctoral committee means a lot, because we cannot understand the development of scholarly research problems and without appreciating the scientific advances and how scientific advances has actually shaped the way we think about research problems and the way we even frame the statement of the problem, right? And of course, as I did say, the history of philosophy of science, generally speaking, actually indicate what we call major intellectual advances, right? That we know that has shaped the existence of knowledge, right? And we need to understand those aspects for us to come up with a very good doctoral research program. So the doctoral research program then should not be understood merely as something not yet studied. And that is what I did present last time, because I've seen many students writing, and then at some stage they indicate that, you know, lots of research or studies have been undertaken in the developed world. But in Uganda, for example, there's no single study, right, on this aspect. Or you say in Tanzania, no single study on this aspect. And many people think that that is how you contribute to knowledge, right? But I told you that knowledge is universal, right? And therefore, the knowledge that you are contributing to is actually universal knowledge. So meaning that you are adding, right, to knowledge that has been developing over years, but from a universal perspective. So you need to understand the knowledge that has been generated probably in Europe, USA, Australia, and somewhere there, so that you are able to contribute something. And that's why I've always emphasized one thing, that you need to do some bit of literature review, right? So that you identify gaps and you problematize those research gaps. Now, just to remind you a few things that we did cover, again, I will not spend too much time on those particular aspects because we covered them. I gave you Karl Popper, right? Conjectures and refutations, right? What he says and how a research problem is actually is supposed to be framed or influenced, right? Using the ideas of Karl Popper, right? And of course, you know, he's one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, right? And there are so many things that he has articulated, right? If you read his works published around 2002 and the earlier works, then you'll be able to understand. And his logic of scientific inquiry is very, very simple, right? You start from the problem. Then from the problem, you go to tentative theory or conjecture. Then, of course, you go to critical testing. And then, of course, you go to refutation or corroboration. And of course, after that, you generate a new problem that is worth investigating. Right. And of course, his principle is built around what we call the principle of falsifiability, right? And he's largely known for that. And of course, he argued that a theory is scientific only if, right, it can, in principle, be falsified by evidence. So the more evidence you pick, the more you falsify these things. And that's why we ask you to test these theories that were developed a long time ago, right? And in certain contexts, right? So that, of course, the objective here, if we follow Karl Popper's conjectures and refutations perspective, is that in principle, right, you want to falsify that theory using evidence, right? And that's why he actually did indicate that a theory that explains everything and cannot be contradicted by any observation is not scientifically useful, right? Because it cannot be critically tested, right? And that is really a central tenet or principle that we need to understand in that particular area. So that's why you test theories, right? Again, this brings in another dimension that you must understand, right, as doctoral students, because if you have a doctoral committee that does not believe in mixing theories, then you should know where they are coming from, right? The perspective here is that you have one theory that you are going to test, right, with an objective of falsifying that particular theory, or problem. Of course, you falsify it using the evidence that you have. So you will be able to contribute to that particular theory if evidence, right, surfaces. And if it stands the test of time, right, and you are unable to falsify it, again, do not lament because you've done your part, right? Another scholar will go out and do the same, right? Maybe he will come up with a contradictory evidence, right? That is possible. So that is from the falsifiability concept or perspective of Karl Popper, right? If you are mixing theory, still the same principle applies. So you must know how you are mixing those particular theories, right? And this is very important because I have seen students, for example, they say that they're using 3 theories, right? But when you look at the 3 theories that they purport to be using, right, they are just picking one theory for one particular variable that the fellow has, another theory for another variable. So if the fellow has about 3 variables, right, in his study, then he says, I'm using 3 theories. But you know, the fellow has never read those 3 theories. He doesn't even understand what is contained in there. And if you critically review the work of a student, you discover that one theory actually surfaces because it covers most of those things that the fellow is presenting, right, in his or her work. And that's why I have always been telling you that unless you have read, right, that particular theory, you have no moral authority to begin talking about a particular theory. If you read about a certain theory from the paper that I published, right, that does not make you an authority or knowledgeable about that particular theory, because in my work, I simply used it selectively just to explain a phenomenon that I was interested in. So that's why you need to pick a book that has that particular theory. If it is institutional theory, then you pick a book by Scott, which is about 500 pages. You read it, understand it very well, then you go ahead and look at the journal articles that have been published over time to see the fellows who have carried out empirical tests about that theory and what they say. So reviewing one theory alone is not sufficient without reading empirical works as well, where the theory has been tested over time and where the conceptualization, operationalization, and measurements has been made clear, right, in those particular papers, and the controversies and the disputes and debates within the literature. And again, reading journal articles alone without reading the book where the theory is documented, again, is very dangerous for you. So you need to read both so that you understand the theory very well, ladies and gentlemen. So again, I think the point I'm making here is that whereas you read the theory, right, but to think about these scholars, right, and that's why we go into the history of scientific progress so that we understand, right, what has been documented over time and how we can use that knowledge to improve our work. So, of course, you need to be very, very, very careful. And I remember giving you examples in this particular area, right? So that gave us what we call the history of scientific progress. I introduced you to Karl Popper. I introduced you to Kuhn, right? But we did not go beyond Kuhn to see what Lactose actually says, and Loudon, right? So those are the things that I think we need to look at. So I gave you the logic of Karl Popper from the problem to the conjecture, testing, refutation, and of course, either refutation or corroboration, and then after that, a new problem will emerge. Right, and I've already talked about falsifiability, and that's one of the aspects that come from Karl Popper's conjectures and refutations. So you need to read that book, and I think I sent you the book, and you know how to use it, right? So again, I think the example we used for some of you, I don't know whether you still remember last time when we met, right? When we were looking at Popperian view of research problems, right? Just to remind you, because you may have forgotten, I did indicate in our previous lecture that from the Karl Popper's perspective, right, a theory predicts one outcome, right? But reality may actually show something that is happening that cannot easily be explained by a particular theory, right? Because the theory has been developed, and that theory is explaining certain things in a certain setting, right? And when you read the theory very well, that is what it is. But in one way or the other, you discover that the reality shows a different position altogether, right? So that could be one perspective, right? Now, the second perspective, ladies and gentlemen, that comes from there, right, is that an accepted explanation, right, may fail under certain new conditions. So when you go through literature, that is really a review of empirical literature, you discover studies that have been conducted, right, trying to test that particular theory. But the scholars are simply saying, yes, whereas this theory explains certain things accurately in this particular settings, but the theory is more or less accepted, right, to explain certain things under, right, those things. But when we see these new conditions emerging, the theory actually fails to explain, right, what is happening in this setting. So that is a second aspect that you probably note from a review of literature, right? And when you continue reading literature, you also discover that empirical findings actually contradict expected, what we call established expectations, right? So there are contradictions, there are disputes and debates within the literature, right, in that case. So that could also be another situation that is occurring. Now, fourthly, you may also discover that there are certain claims in literature, right, that have been made, but they somehow lack sufficient testability, right? So you discover that some of the models that have been developed, they are maybe conceptual in nature, right? Or you discover that certain methodologies that have been used, right, do produce results that point into one direction, but there are many others that have not been really captured in that perspective. So that could be another condition. And probably lastly, you may also discover that there are certain explanations within the literature that probably survive under certain conditions. But when other conditions emerge, right, it may not, right, these explanations may not survive. Or probably you discover that the theory has been tested in a number of settings, right? But when you look at the developing world in certain sectors, let's say finance-related areas, this theory has not been given sufficient testing, right? Now, that is the developing world perspective, but you may discover that largely, right, generally speaking, at the global level, right, that particular theory has not been tested sufficiently or rigorously tested within the finance setting, right? or financial inclusion settings. So that means you actually have room for you to undertake that particular study. So in a way, it is actually shaping the way you are going to come up with a statement of the problem, ladies and gentlemen. If you recall, the example I used last Saturday was that of the social capital theory, right? Social capital. And I did indicate that, for example, social capital may actually predict strong community networks, right? Attempting to improve participation in local development projects. But you discover that empirical evidence from some communities, they actually show that if you have dense networks, right? These dense networks, for example, may produce some kind of exclusion, right? So when you find such a statement within the empirical literature, it makes you to start thinking, right, about this social capital theory and how it has been used in these development projects, right? So you discover that there is an element, right, of elite capture, because if there are dense networks, some individuals or communities are actually excluded, right, because of elite capture. You start thinking about elite capture, or probably because of resistance to external interventions, right? If you have dense networks, they're likely to resist these kinds of things, ladies and gentlemen. So what does it mean to you, right, as a researcher, right? It means that a Poppelian, right, research problem will emerge, right, because the observed evidence actually challenges what we call theoretical expectation, right? Because we know once we have very strong social capital within a particular community, then you'll find that many individuals will participate in these projects, right, and will benefit from the projects. But your discovery is that certain individuals are actually excluded, and the exclusion is because of dense networks. So you can no longer now begin, of course, coming up with a universal explanation that, you know, wherever you have social capital, you have people included in development projects, right? So the situation now changes. So that means the problem you're going to craft will be informed by Karl Popper's conjectures and refutations perspective. And that's why I told you that you actually need to read these scientific papers, because they give you a very good a perspective of how you should actually structure your statement of the problem, right? Now, of course, if we take an example of financial literacy, right, or you can even take financial inclusion or capability theory, right? Again, I'm going to use a hypothetical example. I have not reviewed literature in this regard, but you may discover that, for example, financial capability theory, right, and probably human capital perspective, right, in one way or the other, they suggest that financially literate individuals, right, are more likely to access and use formal financial services, right? And you pick that information from the financial capability theory, and you also pick it from the human capital theory, right? So they all seem to be pointing towards that direction, that if you have financial literacy programs, right, and people become financially literate, right, then they're likely to access and, of course, use financial services. However, from your observation and maybe empirical findings that exist somewhere, you discover that within the developing economies, right, results are a little bit inconsistent. And that's what you are likely to pick from literature, that even with these financial literacy programs, people who are financially literate actually are somehow excluded, right, they excluded from these the use of financial products and services, right? And the exclusion is probably due to institutional aspects. So if you look at the rules, right, the laws, right, that exist within that particular community, right, in one way or the other, they exclude even these other individuals who are financially literate. But you also discover that the advent of technology, so technological advancements and gendered or even structural barriers in one way or the other, they do prevent these financially literate individuals to access and use financial services, ladies and gentlemen. So this contradiction, right, that exists in literature raises a scholarly problem, right, which must be studied in this case. So the implication here is that financial literacy then alone, if you look at financial literacy alone, it does not sufficiently explain financial inclusion outcomes, right? Especially in institutionally constrained environments, and of course, an environment that has all those gendered and technological aspects. So that means you are going to frame, right, a PhD problem from the Popperian perspective, and then you'll be able to come up with a very nice study, right? And so that's why the development of scientific knowledge, right, from Karl Popper to lactose and of course Loudon gives you that kind of thing, right? I think those are those are enough examples, and I don't have to go into details of that. So I did also introduce Kuhn, and that's where we stopped last time. And again, as you can see, this Kuhn contributes to scientific progress, right? Through, of course, paradigms and anomalies and revolutions, right? If you read his book, it's on the structure of scientific revolution, right? And Kuhn is one of those scholars that have actually contributed to scientific revolutions. So he has actually transformed the philosophy of science. And his argument, as I said last time, centers around one important aspect, that scientific progress does not occur through simple accumulation of facts, right? Again, if you recall, some time back when I was talking about problematizing literature, if you recall, I told you that you can problematize literature using, for example, what we call synthesized coherence, right? Progressive coherence, and of course, non-coherence. And those are the three major approaches to problematizing literature. Again, I'll be talking about this at some stage. Right, now, if you're using progressive coherence, it means that in that area, knowledge is developing, right? You don't have a lot of research that's been conducted over time. So if you have not had many studies being conducted, so if you read through, right, the literature, then you'll be able to problematize and say, this is what we know so far in this particular area, right? In the 1940s, these are the issues that were being discussed. In the 50s, the debate shifted into this area. In the 70s, this is it. In 2000, this is it, right? But then you discover there isn't a lot that has been done, right, up to 2026 around this period. And then you indicate that our next logical step in the growing understanding of this concept or idea, we interrogate A, B, C, and D, right? Because you know that's the next logical step in the growing understanding of the discipline, right, or research in that particular area, right? That is it. Now, Kuhn dismisses this, right, that knowledge does not actually grow, right, through what we call simple accumulation of facts about a particular discipline. So that's why for him, he proposed that science develops through paradigms, right, through anomalies, right, through crisis, through scientific revolutions, right? And that's why his work is particularly useful for students, right? Because you are able to explain, right, the problems or the research problems that emerge within dominant intellectual traditions. So that means that you are going to understand the paradigms. Of course, I talked about paradigms here. I think that our first lecture was on paradigms, especially first lecture on the statement of the problem, right, where we looked at the positivist tradition. Then, of course, from there we went to positivism, where we had logical positivism. And I remember two students actually asked questions, and I told them that you can delay those particular questions. But today, if you haven't found sufficient explanations about those two, I'm ready to answer your questions because we have already gone through paradigms. So we understand those paradigms. Now I can answer questions because from there we went into the constructivist, right, paradigm as well, right? And of course, plus a number of other paradigms that came up, right? So Popper believes that knowledge certainly develops within those particular paradigms, and that's why we need to understand those paradigms. So you must understand where you belong. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, when you are crafting your statement of the problem and undertaking your study, you should know the scholars who are informing what you are saying, because if you know that you are coming from Kuhn's school of thought, then you know that you are locating your study within a particular paradigm, right? And according to Kuhn, as I've already said, research problems emerge within those dominant intellectual traditions, right? And of course, as I did say, a paradigm is a shared framework of assumptions, concepts, theories, and methods, or even standards, right? And of course, exemplary explanations, right, that guide a particular scientific community. So you must know that those ones exist within that particular community for you to be able to explain what you are trying to research, right? So that is very important. And I think we've got so many examples. I think I gave you an example, if I recall very well, that is very common in economics, right? And that's why economists do not even believe in, by the way, mixing theories most of the time. That you have picked a macroeconomic theory and you are mixing it with a microeconomic theory. That is unheard of, right? They will tell you if you're using a macroeconomic theory, use it throughout, right from the beginning to the end. If you're using macroeconomic theory, then use it, right? And that's why they will be taking you through. Even your methodology, by the way, will be shaped by that. If you're talking about a production function, they will say, yes, since your work now seems to fall within this production element, right, then you're going to use the production function, and that's the one you're going to modify, right, to even inform your modeling, right, perspective. So right from the introduction to the statement of the problem, right, as you go through the writings and so forth, we know exactly where you are coming from up to methodology, and those are the equations you are going to use. Right, if there are any modifications, the modifications must be made on the equations that do exist in that particular area. So do not simply mix, and that's why you must know where you are contributing knowledge, right? And it's always important to understand the paradigms, right? The disciplines where you belong, because science, according to Kuhn, progresses through paradigms, anomalies, and revolutions. So if you must propose anything, it must be within that particular aspect, ladies and gentlemen. So without forgetting the issue of economics, right? For example, in neoclassical economics, right? For those who belong in that area, or even the field of behavioral economics, right? So if you are in the let's say positivistic, right, behavioral economics in that case, right? We can even extend and go to other areas like psychology, maybe sociology. You are in interpretivist, right, sociology, right? Each one of these must function as a paradigm community, right? and you should not begin mixing things anyhow, right? So Kuhn, as we see, that is Thomas Kuhn, if you remember very well, who is and what he has done over the years. He actually argued that most scientific research occurs during periods of normal science, right? And during normal science, everything is taken for granted, by the way. Now, if you ask the classical economist, everything within the classical economics is actually taken for granted. And researchers in this area do not usually question the paradigm, right, itself. Instead, they try to solve puzzles, right, within that particular paradigm. So whatever they come up with is within that area, and they're solving puzzles within that particular area, right? So they also refine the measurements in that particular area. They also test specific relationships and extend new theories into new contexts, right? And of course, clarify those unresolved issues or probably details in that particular area, right? So if you are a type of person who believes in Thomas Kuhn, then you must be consistent throughout your research work, right, from your introduction up to the end, right? Let me just give a very simple example of the believers in the resource-based view, right? If you believe very much in the resource-based view of the farm, right, that means you have read Barney, and you also have a body of knowledge that has developed in this area, right? So when you go to the internet, you read. So that means you are going to explain everything using resource-based theory. I mean, again, this reminds me a student that we vivaed a few days ago. I attended the viva, right? And the student used actually resource-based theory, right? And I listened to what the student was presenting. Then I asked the student that from what I see and the variables you are using, I do not think these variables actually qualify, right, to fall under this theory called the resource-based theory. But the fellow said, but these are resources. Yes, they are resources, right? But according to the theory itself, there are issues of resources being rare. If you're talking about resources that are normal, right, and can be found anywhere, then where is the component of rare resources, right? You are talking about resources that cannot be imitated, right? But your resources can easily be imitated, right? Then you are talking about, I mean, you know the characteristics and the assumptions of the resource-based view if you're using the resource-based view. So if you're going to use this particular theory and you want to defend this particular theory, ladies and gentlemen, in order to generate competitive advantage, then you must look at how resources are protected from imitation. How are your resources protected from imitation? Or how intangible assets, right, contribute to performance, right? Of course, once you do that, then you find that these are legitimate puzzle-solving activities within an existing paradigm, right? Otherwise, for you just to list resources anyhow, and you say, I combine this theory, resource-based view, with this other theory, because I picked these variables, etc., but without examining the assumptions, right, of the constructs that you are using with, you don't understand the theory very well. And that's why I've been asking you, ladies and gentlemen, to read these theories where they are documented and from the source documents, right? So according to Kuhn here, Thomas Kuhn, in doctoral research, right, many studies will operate within that normal science, whether resource-based theory or dynamic capabilities theory it is. And that's why, by the way, dynamic capabilities theory was developed, because resource-based theory could not explain, right, what was happening within certain environments, right? And that is very true, right? Especially those environments that are very, very dynamic, right? Things are changing very, very fast, right? Then the other one cannot explain, right? Because you're only talking about resources that are rare, right? Resources that are free from imitation, right? And plus a few other things there, right? So that's why now Kuhn comes out, right? And according to Kuhn, an anomaly, right, is actually an observation, right, or probably a finding or a phenomenon that does not fit the expectations of the dominant paradigm. And that is where our friend that is Tess came up with the dynamic capabilities theory to try and explain, right, the things that could not be explained by Bane using the resource-based theory, right? So, of course, ladies and gentlemen, when you go through empirical literature, you'll be able to find these kinds of things. And even when you get a practical problem, you'll be able to identify these things. So, as you can see, when anomalies accumulate within a particular discipline, ladies and gentlemen, and cannot be resolved, right, of course, they create what we call an intellectual crisis, right, that must be resolved. And that's why we always ask you, what is the research gap? What gap are you feeling in the literature? People will only tell you that, you see, this study was done in America, Europe, and in Uganda, nothing has been done. In Zambia, nothing has been done. And so surely at the PhD level, is that a problem that you are investigating? Right. So unless you don't understand what you are doing, right, then you will be able to come up with something that is mediocre in nature, right? And mediocrity will certainly be perpetuated, right, over time, and people will be accepting anything that you craft, right? So I think you can see the point I'm making here is that the statement of the problem that you are going to craft will be punctuated by those intellectual aspects that create a crisis. And that means you'll be coming from the Kuhnian, right, perspective or view, right? And of course, you know very well, using the examples I've been using of Isaac Newton, right, and who is the other fellow? Einstein, right, if you recall, right? Again, that is how Einstein was able to do what? To find a scholarly gap and develop the theory of relativity, ladies and gentlemen, right? Because Isaac Newton had done a great job, right? Isaac Newton actually, his work produces what we call the Newtonian mechanics, right? And that was one of the most dominant paradigms in physics, right? And it explained many physical phenomena with, of course, remarkable success, as I did indicate, right? And there are so many industries that actually developed and adopted his ideas, the laws, Newton's laws of motion and things like that. Even in the area of astronomy, by the way, right? Those ideas are guided, right? But Isaac Newton's perspectives, ladies and gentlemen, could not adequately explain the anomalous precession, right, of Mercury's orbit, right? So it could not say much about those particular aspects. And this anomaly certainly contributed to the eventual, right, development and the acceptance of Einstein's general theory of relativity, right? And of course, his theory, ladies and gentlemen, provided a new explanatory framework. And again, this is taken from the Kuhnian perspective. That is Thomas Kuhn, right? Because knowledge was developing within a particular paradigm, right? So that's why Einstein actually contributes to this particular field, ladies and gentlemen. Right, so we can have so many other examples in your discipline, right? Let's take an example of technology adoption, right? I think I gave these examples the last time. So I think we need to move so that we do not stay on one aspect here, right? So let's go to lactose, ladies and gentlemen. Remember, we stopped at the time when we were more or less moving into IMRE lactose. And within the next probably 30 minutes, I'll be done with this. And then we go to another aspect that constitutes the statement of the problem. But before we go into that, I think we shall answer the 2 or 3 questions that were asked by a student or students into constructivism, right, and other areas. I hope they still remember the questions and they can ask those particular questions, right? Right, so this researcher is Imre Lactose, right? And of course, Imre Lactose's view is that research, or probably science in this case, progresses through research programs, right? And of course, Imre Lactose developed a sophisticated view of scientific progress, right, that attempted to mediate between Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn, right? We've gone through Karl Popper's conjectures and refutations, and we've also looked at Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolution. So Imre Lactose now comes up with a view that actually mediates the 2 positions, right? Because Popper emphasized a falsification, right? While Kuhn emphasized paradigms and scientific revolutions, right? Contributing knowledge within a particular paradigm, right? And of course, I've shown you how you craft a problem based on that, or how you can conceptualize your problem from that perspective. So, but lactose here, or lactose, right, actually argued that science progresses through programs, research programs, rather than isolated theories. Right, so you do not now go into a paradigm, right? You are where you have an isolated theory, right? And begin contributing knowledge, right? So I think you can see he's in one way or the other dismissing, right, the idea of Thomas Kuhn, right? And also reconstructing it, right? And of course, he does the same thing to Karl Popper, right? So according to Imre Lactose in this case, a research program is a structured set of theories, right? A structured set of assumptions, a structured set of methods, a structured set of explanatory strategies that have guided scientific inquiry over time, right? So to him, right, theories are not abandoned immediately when confronted by contradictory evidence, right? Remember, according to Karl Popper, you falsify, right, that particular theory when new evidence emerges that contradicts the original knowledge base that we are aware of, right? So when you get that new knowledge, you probably falsify that particular theory. According to Lactose, this is not how you do it. So whenever you get new knowledge emerging, you do not simply abandon the theory, because unless you have developed a research program, right, that from this point, this is another point you are going to undertake, another point, right, we don't actually consider that to be science, right? Science is developed over a period of time, and therefore you must have a research program. So for Imre Lactose, we don't simply abandon, right, those particular contradictions within a particular paradigm when we get new evidence, right? Instead, scientists often protect the core assumptions, right, of a research program while modifying what we call auxiliary assumptions. So there will be major assumptions for every theory. Incidentally, ladies and gentlemen, if you may not have known, we have the core assumptions and we have auxiliary assumptions. So what we do, we keep on, right, protecting the core assumptions of a theory and modify those auxiliary assumptions. And you can only modify those auxiliary assumptions using using a new research paradigm perspective that comes from Imre Lactos. So you must have a research program, right, that is conducted over time, so that you keep on refining, right, your assumptions over time. Right, so that is why Imre Lactos, by the way, Imre Lactos is loved majorly by economists, right? Because you don't simply tackle those particular theories in economics and dismiss them, right? Even when they have become obsolete, right, at a particular point. But even in the major sciences, right, what you call natural sciences, right, there are certain things that are protected, right? However much you indicate contradictory evidence, then they will say, I think methods, right? Maybe there are issues in the methods, maybe there are issues that are happening, right? Here, or there are certain mechanisms around this area. But of course, that makes sense, right? But you don't simply abandon those particular theories. So that's why Imre Lactos comes up with a concept of what you call hardcore and protective belts, right? The hardcore and the protective belt. And according to Imre Lactos, right, hardcore are the fundamental assumptions that are protected by researchers. So whenever you develop your framework, right, you have those assumptions. And for me, I actually ask my students, once they have come up with a conceptual model, I ask them to document the assumptions under which the model will work, right? Of course, with a view that at some stage, right, if you discover that your core assumptions are protected, right, and the auxiliary assumptions, right, have to be modified in one way or the other using a research program, then you can develop your own theories, right? Ladies and gentlemen, some of the theories that we are using over time, they actually emerged from doctoral studies, right? Especially if a student has a research program. That means that even after completing your PhD, right, you will continue researching in that particular area of yours, right? That where you undertook your study, the topic of study is not abandoned, but you keep on building, right, on that particular topic of study that you have undertaken and improving, so that if you publish around 20 journal articles in that same area of yours, or even 30 journal articles over time, and you're very consistent, then researchers will start referring to your work, for example, as a model. They begin from there that the way you've been talking about these models, the technology acceptance model and other models that you are using, right? Because researchers have been using them, right? And most of the results seem to hold true, right? If you talk about, for example, the information systems model, right? That fellow, I have been tracing the work that he's been doing in that area, right? I can assure he has so many publications, over 40 publications, but it's all about the information systems model, right? And that's why you cannot actually dismiss the information systems model, right? Because the fellow has done that consistently over time and over a number of years. I do not know now how many years, but maybe around 20 years, researching the same area. So in other words, the guy has what we call a scientific program in that case. So that means that he's guided by Lactos, right? So in your area, you can also follow Lactos in this case. So he has the hardcore and protective belt, right? The hardcore consists of those fundamental assumptions, ladies and gentlemen, that researchers within the program do not easily abandon, right? For example, those who are in the area of economics, who use rational choice theory, the hardcore may include the assumption that actors, for example, pursue preferences and constraints, right? Now, that is a hardcore assumption and it will remain there. So the moment you use what we call the rational choice theory, right, you must adhere to this because this has been protected over the years and it seems to be correct, right? So the hardcore has those assumptions, ladies and gentlemen. Now, when we go to the protective belt, ladies and gentlemen, the protective belt, right, consists of what we call auxiliary assumptions and even auxiliary hypotheses, or auxiliary methods, auxiliary concepts, auxiliary conditions, right? that can easily be adjusted, right, when evidence creates difficulties. So when a new evidence emerges in that particular area and seems to contradict, right, the earlier knowledge we know, creating what we call an intellectual crisis in that area, we simply modify those particular assumptions and methods. And that's why someone will use a number of methods, right, within a particular paradigm. Because within even the positivistic paradigm, instead of using one, right, method, you can use multiple methods, right? And that is acceptable, right? As you do this or the other, you also use experiment, you also do A, B, and C, right? Just like in rational choice theory, you will undertake experiments. You're going to use that rational choice theory and you're not undertaking experiments, then we are going to ask a number of questions that you must respond to as a student or as a researcher in that particular area. So when you are being interrogated during your viva, do not say that that man does not like me. No, it means you have not read, right, enough. You've not done a great job in that area. So that's why you must comb, right, every area, right? And the good thing with the PhD study is that you are not studying a very big, area, huge area, but you pick a particular aspect, and what matters is the depth, right, not the breadth, right, in that particular area, ladies and gentlemen. So you keep on refining these that we call auxiliary assumptions, right? When difficulties arise, you modify them. And that's what we call the protective belt. And Imre Lactos is very good at this, ladies and gentlemen. So you must know where you are, right? Whether you are falling in Karl Popper's conjectures and refutations, or you fall in Thomas Kuhn's scientific revolution, the structure of scientific revolution, or probably you fall within Imre Lactos' perspective, right? Who talks about the research program, ladies and gentlemen. So again, as you can see, Imre Lactos comes up with what called progressive versus degenerating or degenerative, right, research programs, ladies and gentlemen. And according to Imre Lactos, that is the question, right? Does the program generate new explanations, right? That's the question you must ask yourself. So Lactos actually argued that research programs may be progressive, right? So you have a progressive research program or you have a degenerative research program. So now a progressive research program, ladies and gentlemen, right, generates what we call novel predictions. That's what we call a progressive research program, right? So you come up with the predictions, right, that are able to stand the test of time. You come up with a theory, for example, that explains new facts, right? Whenever they arise, you apply the theory, it explains. Or a model that you have been using over time, which opens new research directions, right? Every moment, every minute. And that's why we ask you to come up with the areas for further research, because you have used that particular theory. Yes, there are those auxiliary issues that you have observed, right, that require, of course, corrections, right, or probably modifications. And that's why, according to Lactos, these auxiliary can be auxiliary hypotheses, auxiliary assumptions, auxiliary methods, etc. So they may require modifications at one stage or the other. Now, if you discover that your research program that you are undertaking is generating new predictions, right, and again is explaining new facts, so probably is calling for new research directions, or the issue you're talking about is explanatory power. Right? The explanatory power improves as you improve a few things in your methods, modify certain assumptions, etc. Then you are doing a great job. So you are on the road towards developing a theory, actually, right, if you do it very well. Now, a degenerative research program, ladies and gentlemen, merely protects, right, a particular theory from falsification, right, through what we call ad hoc modifications. So somebody will come up with a program, right, and undertakes research and generates new knowledge that is very fine, which is widely accepted by scholars in that particular discipline. But whenever something crops up, right, to try and falsify that particular theory, then there's a tendency by researchers to protect that particular theory from falsification. And what will they do? They will do some bit of ad hoc modifications here and there, right, without really doing very serious research, right, or probably without generating meaningful new knowledge. So they want to tell you, you know, it holds here, it holds in Kenya, holds in Zanzibar, it also holds somewhere else in the Seychelles, and then in the settings, developing world settings, right? Again, maybe these Asian countries, we see that this one is working and things like that. So they'll keep on, right, protecting this, right? So let me give you an example, one illustrative example, right, that you see there, which is the resource-based theory, right? Of course, I'm using this because I've been explaining issues using the resource-based view, right? Now, according to the resource-based view, some of you have used this, you discover that the arguments here, right, built around having resources, and these are the core assumptions, right? Having resources that are valuable, right? So resources must be valuable. Resources must be rare, and resources must be inimitable, right? And of course, non-substitutable. We know that very well. So you cannot tell me that you understand resource-based view unless you identify resources that meet this criteria, right? If you are unable to do so, you are in trouble. So for you to reduce competitive advantage, and you know what we mean by competitive advantage? It means that one farm has an advantage over another farm. Why does it have an advantage? You have resources, right, that are rare and very valuable, right, in the production of a particular product or services. And it cannot easily be imitated, right, by other farms. So if you're using those resources, then that means that you can actually use the resource-based view in this perspective, right? So that is what it is according to Bane, 1991, and a few other years there that come after. By the way, that book is also very huge. I think it has about 800 pages. Again, if you're using resource-based view and you don't have the theory, I can send you the books. I have literally most of the books on the theories that we are talking about here, right? So I can send you the resource-based view. I can send you the dynamic capabilities view. I can send you all those particular books that you need. So, of course, in this case, over time, the scholars who were undertaking studies, they discovered, and I mean scholars were genuinely interested in the development of knowledge. They realized that, yes, this gentleman, Bane, had done a great job. I don't know whether he's a gentleman or lady, but he had, whoever, had done a great job in this case, right? So, but there was a problem, right? That the theory did not sufficiently explain how resources are developed, right? The development of resources, right, is not really articulated by Bane, right? How resources are renewed, for example, how resources are reconfigured, because you can reconfigure these resources, how even resources are deployed, right, in changing environments, right? So it couldn't. So this led actually to the development of the dynamic capabilities theory that was developed by Tess, right? So if you look at the 1990s, actually in the 1997, and I think a few other years, and after those years, right, Barnett developed his dynamic capabilities theory, right? So in this case, if you're going to use lactose, all right, ladies and gentlemen, a lactosian research problem may be framed in such a way that you bring out issues that relate to the ones that I'm going to give you right now, right? It means that you'll be able to say that although the resource-based theory or resource-based view explains how valuable resources, rare resources, inimitable resources, and non-substitutable resources contribute to competitive advantage, right? It provides limited explanations of how firms renew, right, reconfigure such resources under conditions of environmental turbulence, right? So that means that the increasing the increasing need in this case, right, to add dynamic explanations, right, actually suggests that the original resource-based view that we know as developed by Barnett, right, based on that research program of his, requires theoretical extension, right, to explain competitive advantage in volatile contexts. So in such a situation, ladies and gentlemen, you will be allowed, for example, to mix the dynamic capabilities theory and the resource-based theory, right, within a very turbulent environment that you are studying, right? And please make sure that the environment you are studying is a turbulent environment. So which means that your formulation will say, yes, right, these are resources. First of all, you begin by acknowledging that these are resources, right? And whereas some of the resources you are talking about, they actually rare, valuable, inimitable, and non-substitutable, right, in this case. But your concern in this case, right, is actually the dynamism of the environment, and of course, how firms are now reconfiguring these resources to achieve competitive advantage. So you can go ahead and use, if you feel that there's need for you to combine these two theories, because resource-based theory needs an extension by adding these elements that bring in dynamism, right? But if you discover that dynamic capabilities theory alone can explain what you are trying to explain, then do not bring in the resource-based view, right? Because it does not apply at this level, right? So that is one example that you can actually use. Let me give you a second example, right? And then we stop there with these research programs. I don't know whether there's another research program that I bring in here, right? Let me see. No. Oh, Loudon. Okay. Then we shall go to Loudon, and then I'll pause a little bit, right? So before I do that, let me give an example from institutional theory, ladies and gentlemen, right? Now, of course, you know, institutional theory, again, has variations, ladies and gentlemen, if you recall. And last time I told you that you must be very careful if you're going to use institutional theory. Tell us exactly what you're talking about. Are you talking about Max Weber's institutional theory? Because it does exist, right? And there are certain things that he articulated that are very important, right? If you're talking about hierarchies and bureaucracies and so forth, that is Max Weber. Do not confuse that again with Scott, who talks about norms, rules, regulations, right? The culture, cognitive, and plus a number of other things, right? If you are talking about DiMaggio and Powell, right? Because for them, they talk about institutional theory, right? But they bring in the element of isomorphisms, right? The isomorphic pressures. There are those pressures within the environment that will make firms more or less do similar things. And that's why using the word isomorphism. There's a similarity, right, of the things that they do. If you are in the financial services sector, for example, and you are dealing with the commercial banks, you discover that what Stanbic Bank is doing is more or less similar to what Standard Chartered Bank is doing. and probably what DFCU Bank is doing, and plus a number of other banks, right? That means you are operating from the DiMaggio and Powell perspective. Do not now begin confusing us and bring in Max Weber and the other fellows. So you must be able to understand these fields very well and articulate what you are saying. So ladies and gentlemen, if we take an institutional theory example here, let's imagine that we are using DiMaggio and Powell, right? So in this case, you are explaining, right, a phenomenon using DiMaggio and Powell. So you'll be able to say that institutional theory explains how organizations, for example, conform to institutional pressures for legitimacy. And because what institutions are seeking for is legitimacy, so they must conform to pressures. And these pressures come from the regulators, for example, right? They come from professional associations, for example, right? So they are trying their level best. I know that even Scott, in one way or the other, he mentioned something, right? But it does not take this position wholly, right? But DiMaggio and Powell 1983 does. If you again read his famous article on the iron cage revisited, right? Again, if you haven't, I can send you that that article. But I know there's another fellow whom I'm forgetting that go into. I think for him he talks about. Oh, there was a lady who talks about institutional logics, right? Right now I can't recall the name, but in the process, when I recall the name, I'll tell you the name, right, of this person who brings in institutional logics, ladies and gentlemen, right? But again, when you look at those logics, right, the way she manipulates them, you find that, yes, I think this makes sense within the same institution when organizations are seeking for legitimacy, right? But anyway, in our case, we are coming from the DiMaggio and Powell perspective. So you see, yes, you say, well, we know that very institutional theory will explain this. However, organizations sometimes resist, right? These institutional pressures, they resist institutional pressures. They reinterpret these institutional pressures. They even manipulate these institutional pressures. And this is true, by the way, and this is the reality, right? If I have a business operating within a particular environment, I know that there are rules that relate to taxation. Uganda Revenue Authority will be on my neck. So they want me to disclose A, B, C, and D. But if I disclose, I'll close the shop. So what do? I become a little bit opaque in the way I do things. So I must actually look at the institutional framework. And this could be in the area of, for example, environmental health and safety, because I know the rules that relate to environmental health and the safety of the employees. But because I want to resist, I will reinterpret and manipulate and selectively comply with institutional pressures. And that is true. So because organizations sometimes do that, they resist, right? Then it means that you must come up with another theory, because institutional theory will assume certain things, right? So if a theory mainly explains conformity, but struggles to explain issues of agency and resistance, then a research program emerges, ladies and gentlemen, in that particular field. So you come up with a study, and that means your research program, right, will rotate around this. Later on, I'm going to give you a list of issues that must be brought out in a research program. I know people have been taught that, you start with this, a general issue, then you must bring a contradiction, then you must do this. But people do, those people rarely teach students the things that should be there, right? And this is what I'm telling you, how you can actually generate these problems and how you can integrate them in your work, either coming from Karl Popper, right, or Thomas Kuhn, right, for your information, or Imre Lactos, ladies and gentlemen, before we go to Loudon, that I'm going to give you. So that's what it is. But let me just give you an example, right? And I'll give you only one example from procurement for some of you who are here. And you are studying procurement, right, ladies and gentlemen, right? So if we take procurement, right, let's use an example of agency theory, right? For many practitioners who are here and also scholars in the procurement, you know very well what's happening, right? People have become professional thieves. And the loophole they use is actually procurement. And here it doesn't matter whether you're a professional procurement person or specialist, right? Because you're going to have pressure right from the politicians, right? Because in a ministry, for example, you have a minister, you have the PS, you have a number of other things, all right, a number of other fellows, the Undersecretary of Finance and so forth. If you go to an authority, right, let's take an example of a university, for example, a training institution, a university. If you take an example of a university, for example, the Chancellor of Makerere University, for example, is appointed by His Excellency the President, right? And then you have a Vice Chancellor again who is influenced in one way or the other. Then plus all these other fellows. Now, for you, a procurement person, and you are working in the PDU, and you think you are going to be professional in everything that you do. Yes, of course, you'll try your level best. I'm not saying that you are not professional individuals. Do not misunderstand me from that perspective. But I'm saying the realities within the workplace, right, they're totally different. And that's why contracts are actually signed in the bars where people meet and they drink, right? That's why they sign, right? You don't have a signed document there that they actually sit and then sign a document there. No, but they agree. There's a mutual agreement that I'm going to give you this contract, etc., right? And your boss will call you, and that's the accounting officer who is likely to be a PS, again appointed by His Excellency the President, and the politicians have interest in. So they will call you. They'll say, this contract, give it to this person. So because there is a procurement law, you have to work backwards, so that you come up with a contract. But even when you come up with your specifications, by the way, but you know they have a user department, it is, yeah, the user department is there because it must actually somehow demonstrate that they need these items. But even then, items are produced, I mean, they are bought, they are procured, right? There are so many things that are procured and dumped in the ministries, and they're not needed by the user department. Then you begin begging these people to use those things, right? That's a problem. Ideally, I mean, the PPDA Act is very good, right? Because it demonstrates a certain level of professionalism, but the actual practice is different. Meaning that now you must think about theories that are going to explain these things that you cannot easily see, right? Because the Act will not see these things. Even the theories that are being developed will not see these things. Right now, it is you, the scholar, who is going to see these things. So, for example, if we use agency in public procurement, agency assumes that principals are going to use monitoring, right, tools. They are going to use incentives. They are going to use the sanctions to control what we call agent opportunism. And you know what opportunism is? Those are self-seeking behaviors, right, within these institutions. So when you use agency theory, you assume that, you know, you have the mechanism there, the laws exist, you have monitoring systems, you have the boards, right? Because you have boards, by the way, even in other institutions, right? Like if you take an example of National Water and Sewerage Corporation, they have a board, right? And of course, these are parastatals. If you talk about the ones for electricity, you know that very well, ERA, Electricity Regulatory Agency, you name them, they are there, and they're supposed to use the Act, right, while procuring, right? So agency theory assumes so many things. There's monitoring and things like that, incentives and sanctions, right? Now, if you're going to use lactose, like lactosian, imlactosian perspective of generating a research program, right, ladies and gentlemen, you'll find that agency theory provides a useful explanation of the principal-agent conflicts in public procurement. And in doing so, it explains, for example, issues that are even emphasized by the theory, like information asymmetry, issues of monitoring, issues of incentives, etc. However, despite the existence of these things, the monitoring things that I'm talking about, persistent procurement irregularities exist, right? Despite formal monitoring mechanisms, despite all those things that are put in place, these things are there, right? You have procurement irregularities. You go and study the PPDA audit reports, and these are available on their website. There are numerous. Recently, they were talking about the Speaker of Parliament being corrupt. And you've read I mean, you've seen messages in the press, right? And so many writings. But I can assure you that lady will not be taken to court, right? If she's taken to court, the cases will be dropped after a short while, right? She did not do these things without the knowledge of a network anywhere, right? And a network that is also very influential. So that's why I find that, yes, despite agency theory existing, persistent procurement irregularities, and they were talking about these within Parliament, for example. So this suggests that agency-based explanations may require extension through what we call institutional ethical climate, right? If you've read the works of, who is that fellow? I forget his name, Captain, right? Ethical climate. And of course, social network perspectives to try and explain opportunism in the public sector procurement system. So this formulation, if you take this perspective and you come from that point of view or angle, ladies and gentlemen, that formulation will neither abandon the agency theory, right, or nor accept it, right, the way it has been written down and critically, but it positions, right, this kind of study as a refinement or extension of an existing research program that is highly rooted in institutional theory, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why I told you that you need to understand scientific progress for you to be able to contribute to knowledge. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think I'll not spend too much time here, but lactose helps you as a doctoral student to understand that research problems arise not from one failed hypothesis, but from weaknesses in a broader stream of research, right? Or what you call scholarship or research program in this case. So allow me, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to take some water here so that I talk about Loudon, right? And after Loudon, then I'll pause a little bit, right? So let's go to Loudon, right? Who is this Loudon, right? Right. Now, this scholar is called Larry Loudon. And his concern was on problem solving, right? Ladies and gentlemen, remember there's something I say that's, some time back. I told you that a PhD must achieve two things, right? One, must solve a problem, unresolved problem, a pressing problem within a particular community. Then two, you must be able to contribute knowledge. Right. So, according to Larry Loudon, he actually proposed what we call a problem-solving model of scientific progress. Right. So, what he does, what he does in his work, first of all, he begins by criticizing views that tended to treat scientific progress, right, mainly as a truth approximation. Because when people come up with the certain relationships and they have been tested over time, they will actually tend to think that is the truth. And if you remember the way philosophy has developed over time, in fact, initially, philosophy, right, was being defined in terms of justified true beliefs, justified true beliefs, until a certain scholar, and this was actually a student, actually dismissed that idea. I've just forgotten the name. And when he dismissed the idea, and he came up with the very good articulate propositions, right? If some of you have read the works there, and then remember the name, you can remind me the name of that scholar, right? But he dismissed. It's actually called the Gettier, right? Gettier, right? It's called the Gettier problem. Go and read philosophy of science and understand the Gettier problem, right? So when Gettier looked at the way philosophy was being looked at, he disagreed, and he came up with a number of propositions to dismiss that particular thing. Right, so he dismissed it, and he successfully did it. But what the philosophers did were actually to move around and find a way of protecting their discipline, right? So, in other words, according to Larry Loudon, right, scientific progress equals problem-solving effectiveness. So he proposed a problem-solving model of scientific progress. So he began by criticizing those fellows who treated knowledge as truth, as absolute truth, or approximation of truth, right? Or as approximation of falsification from Karl Popper's perspective. In other words, he dismissed Karl Popper. And of course, he also dismissed the works of Imre Lactos, who was looking at paradigm, right? And first of all, the other fellow, Thomas Kuhn, right? And then later on, Imre Lactos. So for Loudon, scientific theories should be evaluated by their capacity to solve important problems within our communities. So if you have a theory that is able to explain everything within a particular community, then you are very close to what Larry Loudon actually did articulate, right? So of course, ladies and gentlemen, this perspective, as you see it, if you remember the other student when you were having a class at Makerere University, or the fellow of the fish, right, hatcheries and things like that, the way he was very protective, that that tells you that the fellow was only bent solving a practical problem, and not only a practical problem, but an economically viable problem, right? That's why he said, well, these parasites that we're talking about have economic importance. And for me, what my supervisors were telling me to do not seem to have economic importance. When I reviewed the literature, this was not have economic importance. That means that student was coming from largely a problem-solving perspective. But of course, his problem is that he thought that there's no theory that explains that. So, of course, this is an area that is very, very important because according to Loudon, this shifts attention from merely identifying gaps, right, to asking a question as to whether your work contributes to meaningful debates within policy and practice, right? And that's why these days at Makerere University, they will bring these policy makers, right? As you're making your presentations, right? They'll bring somebody from industry, they'll make someone from policy, and just to interrogate you, right? The issue is about problem solving in this case, right? So, in other words, there are so many problems. And that's why Makerere University now has told you that we want to solve problems within communities, within societies. So that's why you must look at Vision 2040. You can actually begin from the upper level. You look at SDGs. Then from there, you look at the African Union. You look at also East African frameworks. Then from there, you come and look at Vision 2040. From there, you must look at also other frameworks, right, and also review some policies in our context here, right, so that you identify the policy gaps that must be integrated, right, in your PhD research, so that at the end of the day you can actually contribute knowledge, right? But of course, whereas that is very true, right, ladies and gentlemen, there are empirical problems, right, that we need to understand. Right. And those empirical problems must be brought out, right? We can I can give you a number of examples, like why do some SMEs survive, right? Economic shocks while others collapse. That is a real justifiable issue. Why do some public reforms, for example, fail despite strong legal frameworks or regulatory frameworks? Like even in procurement in this case, right? There are issues we're discussing, right? How come procurement is going wrong, right? Even when we have very strong regulatory frameworks. So this, the empirical problems must be brought up. We must also bring out conceptual problems, right? These arise within theories themselves. They may include contradictions and ambiguities. So you must find a way of combining these two if you're going to use Loudon, right? So let me just give you an example, ladies and gentlemen, that uses Loudon, and then we shall end there, right? Let's take a family business example, right? And that will be all, right? Let's imagine, and I saw a student last time, I think at Bakere, who was studying the first generation indigenous family-oriented business or businesses. And this fellow was talking about collapse, right, of a few of these family businesses. And he was saying, why do many first generation indigenous family-owned businesses actually collapse after founder exit? And we have also a number of examples in Uganda. You know them. So in this case, you must identify two things, the practical problem and the conceptual problem. So the conceptual problem here is that if you review the family-owned business literature, right, you discover these family-oriented literature or scholarly or empirical literature actually assume that succession planning ensures continuity. And that's why you find so many bodies saying, yes, there must be succession, right? You even go to these companies and give them advice on succession planning, right? But you forget that succession planning or the success of succession in this case may actually depend on a number of issues. One of those issues are intangible resources. And those intangible resources include things like trust. You know, according to social capital is actually a resource. And within it, you have intangible resources like trust. So the success, right, of these family-owned businesses, ladies and gentlemen, to survive, right, will actually depend on those intangible resources if they are well managed, right? You have trust, you have governance quality, right? Yes, within the institution itself, there could be certain governance mechanisms, but the quality of the governance, and that is intangible in nature, right? And probably organizational routines, right? You'll not be able to catch these, right? But they're there, and also intergenerational legitimacy. So you have individuals who remain behind, but they cannot bring up this element of legitimacy. So that means you frame something like this, that although succession planning is widely presented as central to family business continuity, the persistent collapse of many post-founder indigenous family-owned businesses suggests that succession planning alone may not sufficiently explain sustainable competitive advantage or success or performance of these businesses. So, in other words, you have reviewed literature and you are telling us that existing literature, right, that you have reviewed provides limited conceptual clarity on how intangible resources, such as the trust that I talked about, governance quality, and even succession quality, by the way. The quality of succession means, do not simply say there's succession planning and someone has, but succession policy is not interrogated. So that means that literature is silent, right, about these intangible resources, right, and how they interact to sustain performance of these businesses, family-owned businesses across generations. So what happens at this level, ladies and gentlemen, is that you are formulating, right, an empirical and conceptual problem, right, that must constitute in one way or the other your statement of the problem. I'm not saying that your statement of the problem entirely will have these, right, but I'm saying these components must be there if you have used Larry Loudon's perspective, right? So the formulation of that nature, ladies and gentlemen, will solve both an empirical and conceptual problem, ladies and gentlemen. So I think I will not go into details to give you, right, how you are going to frame this, because we shall be moving into that area later on. But my interest was actually to tell you that research programs or scientific research programs in one way or the other do determine the problems that we are going to work on and how we state those particular research problems or statement of the problem, ladies and gentlemen. So, ladies and gentlemen, all these aspects that we have looked at, for example, Karl Popper, Thomas Kuhn, and Lactose and Loudon, they have a number of important lessons, right, to you, and think about them, right? And those aspects are that Popper will teach you how research begins with the problems and advances through conjectures and the testing and the criticism and the possible refutation, right? Now, as you move from Popper, Kuhn teaches that research problems often arise out of anomalies within paradigms, and Lactose teaches you that research problems emerge within broader research programs, and that even when you are formulating your topic, think about those particular aspects, right? And of course, those research programs, they might be progressive or degenerative in nature, but also know that these elements are telling you not to come up with the topics casually, right? So a research problem should not be a casual topic, personal interest, or even an isolated practical problem. So it should be what we call an intellectually defensive problem which is located within the development of knowledge. So, ladies and gentlemen, as PhD students, ask yourself the following questions, right? One of the questions that you are going to ask, right, is that what problem is your study solving? What existing explanation is failing? What anomaly, right, dominate assumptions, right, within this commonly taken for granted paradigm, right? What dominant assumptions need questioning, right? What theory, for example, has lost explanatory power, right? What empirical problem remains unanswered, ladies and gentlemen? And what problem will my study help solve, right? Now, to me, ladies and gentlemen, these questions will move your doctoral research from mere description to scholarly contribution, ladies and gentlemen. So let me stop there in this area, and if you have any question, because we need to rest, right, for 10 minutes, and then maybe when I come back, we ask questions and I try to answer those particular questions, but I can give you an opportunity to respond before we go for rest, right? And I'll begin with the questions that have been raised, like the previous questions, and then I'll take about 30 minutes introducing something new. And I think this time I'll take you to those particular aspects that constitute a very good research problem. Right. Anyone would like to ask a question? Allow me to turn off. I think I forgot to turn off my video. Allow me to turn it off as you ask questions. Right. Paul Buhenga, you want to say something? Any first unmute to speak.
Thank you, Prof. Not for now. I'll ask a question later. Thank you.
Okay. Another person would like to ask a question? I can see Joan. Joan, you put on your video. I don't know whether you have a question to ask. All right. I can see Singoma.
Yes, Professor. Still, my question is, good morning, Prof. and my colleagues. My question still is ahead, is on research problem. So, which you are going to handle next. So, I think after my question will come in, Prof.
If you are going to do what?
Prof, my question is on research problem, which you said you'll be handling in the next 3 minutes. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So you want to stay that question and ask it later.
Yes, please. I have reserved it for when we reach the rational question to ask.
Okay. Then another person, can you help me mute some of those mics that are misbehaving? I can see this is the Joan. Let me mute. But you could mute the video first, Joan, and then okay. I don't know whether it is still on, but it was creating problems. Okay, another one. No question. Okay. Since we don't have questions, there's a gentleman. Allow me to give you 10 minutes break. It is now 10:47. We return at 10:57 so that we look at another perspective. Right. Of course, I'll begin by handling the questions that were raised by students last time. Questions on logical positivism and the statement of the problem. And of course, the other one was interpretivism, if I remember very well, and constructivism, right? And I am very sure many other students have more questions now that we can handle. So I'll begin with the question and then the questions and then proceed to another level. Right, enjoy your break. You can move around, right? But we expect to begin at 10:58. Right, but we can say at 11. Right, we begin at 11 again. Right, enjoy your day and enjoy your break, but we are coming back at 11. Right, bye for now. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back from your break. It's exactly 11, right? And I think we are set to begin and conclude. We agree that when we return, we shall begin by answering those questions that were asked by students. Right, and I want to begin with a question that was actually raised by Fred. Fred, are you online? Israel, I saw your... I know there's a question you asked on positivism and logical positivism. I don't exactly remember what you were asking. Where are you?
Good morning. Good morning, Prof, and good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm here.
Yes,
The
please.
question was, what is the difference between positivism and positivism, something like that? Yeah.
Okay, and there is another question that was on interpretivism. I can't remember exactly how it was phrased, but whoever asked that question, you can actually repeat. But let me start with this, and then we'll get to this second one, right? Now, of course, I know that if you're going to look at journal articles and read, there's also a certain amount of confusion within the literature that does not allow you to pick the difference between these two, right? Because sometimes they are used interchangeably in the research methodology discussions. Yet they actually represent different, or what we call distinct philosophical traditions, right? And these philosophical traditions, they are separated by historical period, they are separated by intellectual emphasis, and separated by assumptions regarding the nature of knowledge and scientific inquiry. So they do not mean exactly the same thing, right? Although people tend to confuse the two. Just to remind you what we covered, Fred, last time, was that when we are looking at classical positivism, it actually emerged around 1798 to a period that I can't remember very well, but around the 1850s, if I am not mistaken. And of course, this began with the Augustine, or actually Augusto, not Augustine, Auguste Comte. I think it's because this fellow generally had a French background, right? Auguste Comte, around that period, right? And of course, Comte argued that knowledge progresses through 3 stages. And I gave you those stages last time, if you recall. One being the theological stage. That is from theology. Right, we take things for granted and by faith most of the time. Right, everything that you cannot explain, you attribute it to God. Right. Even when you should actually explain what has caused, for example, the drying up of this river here, then you say it is God. But you know very well that human activities have had an impact, right, on that river. What has caused the collapse of this building that they have been constructing, and then you say it is an act of God. Even when you have explanations that in terms of the foundation wasn't very good, the mixture, right, mixtures of sand, cement, and so forth were not proper, the quality of sand, the quality of cement, and things like that. Even when you can explain, you say it is God. So, according to Comte, that is that is stage number 1. And even today, by the way, there are so many things that we attribute to God, but I can assure you with the time, some of those things will be explained, right, by human beings. That does not take away the fact that God exists. No. You know, the problem with many people, they think that when you begin interrogating issues, you become atheist. You don't believe in God, right? Contrary to that view, we are seeking for knowledge and we do not know enough. So we cannot say we are the Alpha and the Omega. And that's why, according to Karl Popper, he talks about conjectures and refutations. Imre Lactose research program. But Thomas Kuhn, he then believes in scientific revolution within a particular paradigm. And then Loudon talks about the practical problems. So theological stage becomes the first stage. Then the second stage is the metaphysical stage, right? That we also saw last time, right? If you remember, right? And of course, that dismisses, right, the theological stage. So you have the second stage, but you move to the third stage, which is scientific, right? And that is the positive stage or scientific stage. So that means in the positive or scientific stage, you base your explanations on observations, on experimentation and scientific laws run rather than theological speculation or metaphysical abstractions. And for some of you who have done metaphysics as a branch of philosophy, you understand very well. Even when you are going to explain, right, for example, the nature of a human being, right, the nature of a tree, the nature of a human being, right, metaphysics does it very well because you say a human being has three parts, right? You talk about the body, then you talk about the spirit, and then the soul. And you can begin now dissecting those components and then provide explanations. So you are operating within the metaphysical stage. So you begin with the theological, general observations, metaphysics, where you go into the nature of reality, nature of a tree, nature of a human being, right? And even the nature of the soul. If you're talking about the soul, you must make it feasible so that people understand. But by the time you reach the level of scientific stage, which is positive, then you must, with based on our observations, experiments that we carry out and scientific laws, rather than mere speculation and belief in this case. So I gave you the core assumptions of positivism, the ontological, if you recall, and allow me not to get back to those things that we discussed last time, but to take you to logical positivism, right? Logical positivism, ladies and gentlemen, emerged around the 1920s, right, and 1930s through the Vienna circle, right? And the movement to logical positivism combined two things here, right? And of course, the two that were combined include empiricism and symbolic logic, right? Now, of course, within the empiricism, right, there's a general belief that knowledge, of course, originates in experience. The more experience we have with a phenomenon, the more knowledge we extract, right? And of course, that is empiricism. But there is also symbolic logic, right? Of course, where knowledge should be expressed using what we call precise logical structures. For some of you, if you look at set theory, it's a very good example of symbolic logic. Set theory, right? That is something we are taught right from primary. A set of animals. So you pick the animals and you say these are the animals. So you go to the animal kingdom and you start picking them and you place them there. That's a set of animals. Then you can say a set of trees, right? And then you have another set. And then you see, or maybe you categorize and say living. I remember in primary school we are taught living things and non-living things. So that's a set, the living things and non-living things. Right, even us when we try to conceptualize, right? Conceptualization involves what we call symbolic logic. So you express knowledge using precise logical structures. Where you say that if you're dealing with the climate change, right, these are the aspects. So you have constructs there, right, and also variables. So we are using set theory unknowingly. And for some of you who have used the fuzzy logics in your research, PhD research, or those who are using fuzzy logic, again, you know that we are applying the knowledge of set theory there, right? So logical positivism combines empirical, what we call empiricism and symbolic logic. So the experience is there, but also logically presenting these things. So of course, the fellows who contributed largely to this, I think one of the fellows called it Stebbing, around 1930s. I can't tell you the actual year because I can't remember. But Stebbing, S-T-E-B-B-I-N-G, right, Stebbing. And of course, Stebbing combined, right, the ideas of Comte, right, and that is Auguste Comte, positivism, and he picked what we call Comte's anti-metaphysical orientation, right, because he was talking about, of course, Auguste Comte, how knowledge progresses through theological, right? Then from there you go to the metaphysical, right, up to the time when you reach, of course, the scientific progress. So, of course, when he did this, right, he used a framework, a logical framework. Actually, it is a logic that was developed by one of the scholars, Frege and Russell, right, to try and, I mean, the way you also go through conceptualization, operationalization, we tell you that you cannot come up with your own conceptualization, operationalization, you must pick this from literature. So that means there are known knowledge structures within literature that you pick, and you place those particular constructs in those knowledge structures. So logical positivism in this case believed that many traditional philosophical problems, ladies and gentlemen, resulted from a misunderstanding of language rather than what we call genuine problems concerning reality, because the reality remains the same, but there will be a misunderstanding of language, the language you use to express this and to place this within the knowledge structures. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you want me to give the similarities, there are so many similarities and differences to this, but I can just list a few, right, in terms of similarities between positivism and logical positivism, right? One is commitment to science. I mean, both frameworks do that, right? They regard science as the most reliable source of knowledge. Empirical orientation is there because they both emphasize observation, evidence and experience. Issues of rejection of speculation, both of them actually reject speculation. Then the preference for explanation, because they all seek causal explanations rather than subjective interpretation of what is happening, right? And there's also the other aspect of law seeking orientation. They both seek towards developing patterns, right, after identifying problems or challenges within that particular framework. But the differences are also there, right? In terms of historical origin, positivism, of course, that was Auguste Comte during the 19th century. Logical positivism, that is Vienna Circle, right? And that is around the 20th century. The intellectual focus, again, whereas there is scientific observation, right, in positivism, the logical positivism emphasizes language. So there is logic, there is language, there is verification of meaning, right? And of course, phenomenon that occur, right? Then in terms of the philosophical orientation, positivism is just partner in science. But of course, logical positivism just brings clarity, right, of scientific language and of course, certain languages or words or meanings rejected as meaningless, right? In terms of logic, right, if you look at logic, positivism believes logic is very important, but secondary. But in logical positivism, logic is very important. So that's why during your vivas, when you'll be presenting, people will be asking you the logic right, behind the work that you are presenting. Right, so that means they believe very much in what we call positivism that comes in the 20th century, of course, with the logical positivism, ladies and gentlemen. So language becomes a primary issue in the logical positivism, whereas in positivism, it's given less emphasis. So I think you have the issues there, the difference between the two. Now, of course, when you are presenting your work, right, people may not go into details of interrogating you as to where you belong, but ideally Karl Popper, if you look at Karl Popper's work, right, it's more or less within the positivism. That's why he contributed a lot, right? So if, for example, you wanted to study financial inclusion, Fred, since you are the one who asked this question, and I saw your research more or less goes into that direction of finance, I can't remember exactly what you're working on. But a positivistic will ask a question: does financial literacy, for example, influence financial inclusion? So that question, the emphasis is actually on measuring variables and the testing relationship between these variables. But a logical positivist will ask a different question, right? He will ask a question: what exactly do we mean by financial literacy? Because what you understand by financial literacy, right, may not be exactly the same as I understand what financial literacy is, right? So what do we mean exactly by financial literacy? How can it be operationalized, for example? What observation will verify, right, the claims that we are making in this research? And therefore, the emphasis shifts from relationships in this case and takes into meaning and verification. And this is more or less close to the question that a student asked. I can't remember exactly what it was, but he was asking that, can't I have these two knowledge structures within the, if I triangulate, if I use multiple methods, right? And if you recall earlier on, I'd said no, if you are using this, then you are going to be largely, I think it was about mixed methods. Now I remember mixed methods, right? And say, well, you must use qualitative and quantitative, right? But I think we are looking at Basker, if you recall, right? Basker's critical realism, right? Philosophical orientation. And then I remembered that Basker actually, if you're going to use critical realism, you can do it within one framework, like the positivistic framework, but you use different methods, right? You can have a survey, but also have an experiment, right, conducted in that area. So again, there will be critical realism, right, in that perspective. So that is what positivism is, and logical positivism. Fred, have I answered your question? Fred is not there. I can't see him on the platform. All right.
Yes, Prof, you have answered, but I'll consult you further again.
Okay. Then there is another person who asked a question. Actually, for me, even if I don't touch another element, we could use this for questions and answers. But there's someone who asked a question about mixed methods, I think, right? And that was, I think it was interpretivism and constructivism, right? If I recall very well. Is that so?
Yes, Prof.
Now, who is saying yes?
Prof, this is Andrew Mompenje.
Andrew Mompenje, but you had forgotten your very question that you asked. Yeah?
Yes, Prof, when I read about constructivism, it presupposes that reality is relative, subjective, and social and culturally constructed. And when I also read about interpretivism, it almost have this a similar understanding. So I was asking whether interpretivism and constructivism are one and the same, or there is any difference.
Okay, Mumpenje, thank you very much for the question that you have asked. I think this is a question that is worth, right, answering. And actually, my thinking is that when I am done with your question, and I've also seen one or two more questions from Okware, and the rest of it, then I should not actually continue. We should close. Right, and then we shall move to the other aspect later on. Right, interpretivism and constructivism, right? And of course, our concern here are the philosophical traditions, right? So both interpretivism and constructivism, they are usually among the most influential philosophical traditions that underpin qualitative research in the social sciences. And one of the things that you should note here, which is very important, is the element of qualitative research, right? Qualitative research. So if you take that perspective of qualitative, then interpretivism becomes very important, and constructivism, and you can choose, right? But of course, when you get confused, right, then that means that you are likely to use any one of them without knowing what you are doing, right? So I should let you know that these two traditions actually emerged partly as reactions against what we call positivism and logical positivism that Fred has just asked, right? So in other words, positivism and logical positivism were being dismissed and even criticized for treating social reality as if, right, it were actually synonymous with a world where you simply pick an object and you say, this is what it is, right? And yet we are dealing with the social construction of those particular realities, right? So these two came up, and you are right to say that interpretivism and constructivism emphasize the socially meaningful nature of human action, right? They both accept that and reject the positivist assumption that a social phenomenon can be understood solely through objective observation, where you have reality as one, right? But here reality can actually be two. So Mumpenje, I can let you know that although the two traditions share assumptions, right? And many assumptions are shared, like just like positivism and logical positivism. And although people tend to use some of these interchangeably in research methodology, right? They are not identical. They are not identical because interpretivism primarily focuses on understanding the meanings individuals attach to their experiences and action. Mark my words, interpretivism will focus on understanding the meanings that individuals will attach to their experiences and actions. But when you deal with the constructivism, mark the word constructivism, which comes from construction. Constructivism. Constructivism will emphasize how individuals and groups actively construct those meanings. How do they construct those meanings? Through interaction and social processes. Whereas the social reality exists in both, the other one is interested in the meaning behind those interactions. But this one here is interested in the construction. How do individuals construct? And therefore, if you have used the social construction, right, perspective, then you need to bring out those aspects. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me not to go into the history of these two, since we covered them, right? We looked at also the ontological assumptions under each and epistemological assumptions under each, right? Just like the epistemological assumptions of interpretivism, right? There's contextual, experiential, co-created. We looked at all these things, right? And also methodological implications, by the way. If that is what it is, then the methodologies you are going to apply will include, for example, phenomenology. You can use phenomenology. You can use hermeneutics, for example. You can use ethnography. You can use narrative inquiry. You can use case studies. You can use participant observation. You can use in-depth interviews. And that is for interpretism, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry. Right. Now, when you go to constructivism, right, of course, we know how it emerged, and but you have the individuals who are behind this, right, that have actually shaped constructivism, right? For some of you who have been exposed to some kind of psychology, right? You know Jean Piaget, right? His theory, that is largely constructivist in nature. You have other people like Vygotsky, right? That is largely constructivist, right? Then you have other people like Thomas Luckmann. You have others like von Glassfeld, right? All those. So in constructivism, ladies and gentlemen, if you're going to use a constructivist orientation, a philosophical orientation, right, then you are going to assert that knowledge and reality are actively constructed through social interactions, through language, through culture, and through shared experience. Right. The way you are going to construct reality out there will depend on a number of things, as we have seen here. So it is the individuals and the participants that are going to construct knowledge, right? So rather than merely interpreting reality in this case, right, individuals participate in constructing it, right? And that's what you'll be researching on. So therefore, in this case, reality is not simply experienced. Reality is constructed, and constructed by who? By those individuals, right? And of course, there are ontological assumptions of constructivism, like socially, reality is viewed as socially produced, as historically situated, culturally mediated, and this could be shared by the others, by the way, but continuously negotiated, and reality does not exist independently of human interpretation and interaction, right? But those social processes that we go through will help you to construct that particular reality. So knowledge is constructed according to the epistemological assumptions. Knowledge is negotiated. Knowledge is historically contingent, and of course, socially produced. Right. So in this case, this philosophical orientation has what we call methodological implications, right? So your methodological implications, if you're using constructivism, right, will largely, as a constructivist, you will employ, I'm sure you remember the question that was asked by one of the students. I don't remember exactly, but I think it was in the public health last week, right? It was largely situated in constructivism, right? I think the fellow was talking about children. No, I think it wasn't in public health. It was in education, right? I was talking about children. What happened to learning, right? Using using ICT during COVID-19, right? And what he's looking for is actually that element of constructivism. So how did these disadvantaged learners, right? The fellows who were physically challenged, right? Like the ones who are suffering from autism, and I think he gave so many other examples. How did they construct knowledge, and how did they receive it on their end? So did the learning actually take place during COVID-19? So his approach is this largely constructivism and is looking at the philosophical perspective of constructivism. So the methodological implication here is that you are going to employ grounded theory. You can employ constructivist grounded theory. Again, you have to look at the works of Shamaz. I've forgotten the other two ladies that have greatly contributed to this area. So you will not be using the other ones, right, under the other approach, but these ones. You can also use participatory research. You can use discourse analysis. You can use ethnograph as well, right? Whereas some of these could be used the other side, but the way you pick these will be different. So if I could just give you a summary of the differences, right? One of the difference comes from this, what I call a central concern, right? Under interpretivism, your concern is understanding meanings, right? Of course, as given to you by the participants or the researchers. Under constructivism, your concern is understanding construction of meanings. Construction of meanings. Excuse me. The second one will be on reality, right? Focus of reality, right? Interpretivism, the focus is on interpretation. On constructivism, the focus is on construction, right? The reality under interpretivism, right? There is a subjectivity, right? But this one here, right, believes entirely in what you call social construction, right? So meanings are socially constructed, right? The role of language, for example, and interpretivism, right? There is medium expression, right? But when you come to because there you are looking for expressions, meanings. Under construction, you are looking at the medium of construction. So how are these constructed, right? So, for example, if I give you an example, let me use this example, right? Digital agricultural technologies. Again, if for some of you who attended Sunday meeting, it was the other Sunday, there was a student who was presenting, I think the student was from Zambia, presenting these farmers and use of agricultural technologies. So if you're going to use, for example, interpretivist orientation, so you have a question like, how do small farmers experience and interpret digital agricultural technologies? So here your focus will be experience, perception, and meaning, right? But if you are a constructivist, you'll ask the question differently, right? So you will ask, how do small farmers construct meanings regarding digital agricultural technologies through social interaction and community practices? So the focus here is in terms of creation of meanings. You are looking at the social negotiation. You are looking at collective construction, because you may assume that each farmer does his things independent of the other. But you and me know very well that we actually learn from each other, right? And this is very true in the African sense, where we have the Ubuntu perspective. Right, so ladies and gentlemen, I hope for Mumpenji, I have answered your question. Have I?
Yes, Prof.
Okay, I can see Rafael Baku, right? Your hand is raised. And let me see if there are also questions in the chat room that I hadn't looked at, right? As we try to listen to Rafael, then I answer these questions too, and that will be the end, right? I can see some questions. There are some questions here in the chat room. Right, go ahead, Rafael, and then thereafter I'll respond to the questions in the chat room.
Thank you, Prof. I hope I'm audible.
You are.
Thank you. At the beginning, you sounded a bit critical about using more than one theory in addressing the research.
Yes, sir.
Or the research problem. Now, my research is about forest tenure and in relation to sustainable forest use of forest resources. Within that, for me, my finding was that there are two kind of general theories I could apply. The theory of institutional analysis and development, which sometimes is called a theory, sometimes is called a framework. Then there is another one which appears to be general and that could complement that theory of institutional analysis and development, which is political ecology, which addresses history, the historical background of the forest-related issues. So I thought I could try to see how to combine those two as general principles, just general theories. But also within the forest tenure we have in Uganda, we have several of them. And each of them seems to have a different theory, which can be used for analyzing or explaining. For example, we have the forests which are under the Ministry of Water and Environment now, which used to be under NFA, the Central Forest Reserves. That one could be addressed using the theory of public trust, because the state or the government is supposed to be holding those forests which are in central reserves in trust for the people of Uganda. But also there are private forests which exist on the private land, and therefore they are private, they belong to the owners of the land.
I hope by the time
That
you,
could be,
I hope by the time you reach the end, I wouldn't have forgotten the question you are asking, because now I'm losing
yeah, now
track
the question,
and direction of the question.
the question is, since there are different theories that address different components of my research, how can I avoid using different theories for the different components? Because you seem to say it may not be proper or appropriate to use different theories, for example, for each of the components or each of the questions, research questions.
All right, Raphael, I'm going to give you 2 or 3 perspectives. And again, I hope you not take them in an offensive manner.
Oh, definitely not.
The mere fact that the mere fact that you are using so many words and taking around 5-10 minutes to explain the question, not actually to put across a question, that demonstrates that you haven't understood very well what you are studying. That is one. I hope you not take it in a bad way. Otherwise, if you had understood, it will take you a very short time to articulate the question. Right. Number 2, when you say that I said that you should not, that means you've not been attentive too. Right. You've not been
I
attentive.
think you appear to be critical.
Just a moment. You know, it's like a story of the elephant. I don't know whether you've heard about the elephant issue, where 5 blind people, and sometimes I ask myself, how did the blind actually go to see? Because you cannot see, you are blind, but you go to see an elephant when you are blind. That is very funny. But one picked the tail and gave a description of an elephant using a tail that looks like a snake. Another one got the leg or somewhere, and they said, well, I know it's like a trunk of a tree, right? Another one held another part. So at the end of the day, all of them were correct. in the perspective of indicating that the elephant has each of those things, but none of them came up with the entire description of an elephant. So even you, I think you've not attended all the lectures. Maybe you just jumped in this. The first aspect I did, the first thing I did was to give you the philosophical orientations. What do, for example, the positivists say? The logical positivist, right? The constructivist, right? And the interpretivist. And all of those fellows do not agree. And that's why somebody has just asked here a question. What is the difference between positivist and logical positivist? What is the difference between the constructivism, right? And I hope you've been attending. So
Yes,
they share a number of things, but sharing does not mean that they're exactly the same. So they share, but they don't mean the same thing. Now, the other thing I've been doing is to give you a statement of the problem. I've been indicating how you construct literature under each of those philosophical orientations so that you generate a problem for investigation. So the fellow from the constructivist will have his own. But do not forget that I also gave you how science has progressed over the years, starting with Karl Popper, conjectures and refutations, right? Thomas Kuhn, the structure of scientific revolution, right? And they all have a few things that are more or less similar, but their perspectives are totally different. Then from there, I took you to lactose, Imre, right, with scientific progress. Then from there, I took you to Loudon, the problem-solving approach. Right. Now, you, Raphael, I hope you are not telling us that you have a study that cuts across all philosophical orientations. One, positivist, logical positivism, constructivist, and the various philosophical orientations, and also cuts across the various scientific or fields of scientific progress, from lactose, right, to, of course, you have Karl Popper, lactose, Loudon, and so forth, and Thomas Kuhn. You can't have a study like that. So there are those scholars who disagree with the fact that you cannot have 5 theories combined, 3 theories combined. And you must know the doctoral committee and the people who is going to examine you. What is his orientation? If he feels it's one theory, it is one theory. Just like our students, the students at MOOCs, right, have been using success stories, right? It has its own strengths, but it has its own weaknesses. And for them, instead of thinking of a statement of a problem, they say, no, we are going to have a statement of opportunity. But there is no single book on methodology that talks about statement of opportunity. It's not there. But it's a perspective of some individuals that are developing knowledge in this particular field and convincing others to join, right, this particular research program. I don't know whether you are following what I'm saying, my friend Raphael. So if you are following lactose, for example, who talks about a research program, you should know what lactose says about theories, right? If you are following Karl Popper, then you should know what he's saying, whether you're going to mix theories or you not mix. But this business of having theories, from here I've seen students don't read widely at the university. And the purpose usually of having many theories is to cover up their weaknesses or their inability to read, conceptualize, and understand, and even theorize the problem. Because where you suggest around 3 theories, you may find that one theory actually does a good job. And that's why at the end of the day, when you reach this area, what we call theoretical implications, you are unable to articulate any theoretical implication. Because even when you have a mixed theory, you must know the anchor theory. There must be main anchor theory. My work is anchored on resource-based theory. That's full stop. Right. Now, these ones here that you add simply offer, right, additional information that could be used to improve the anchor theory. Right, but many students, you ask the student, yes, you use the 4 theories, you mixed them, fine. What is your anchor theory? The student will not tell you. He will tell you, me, I mixed. Me, I triangulated. Then you ask the fellow, how did you triangulate? Because even in triangulation, you must have an anchor theory. Right? Then you must have the other ones that supplement. What are the supplementary theories? And what are they contributing to your problem that you are investigating? Remember, the whole thing starts with a problem. And the problem must have a number of things, including a gap that exists in literature that you are going to problematize. And I think throughout my lecture today, starting at 9, I've been showing you how you problematize these things using those structures of scientific revolutions, not the progress, right? Scientific, the progress of scientific knowledge, right? From Karl Popper, right, to Thomas Kuhn, then Imre Lactos and Loudon. And all of them have their own perspectives of looking at things. So you cannot tell us that you're combining all of them. It is not possible. If you are using Loudon, who believes in the conceptual issue and the practical problem that you are going to solve, and you must solve it, then bring it out. It's like in critical realism, the emphasis is on solving a problem. If a methodology solves a problem within your work, then go ahead and use it. And that's why you find people using multiple methods. Now, multiple methods does not mean mixed methods. So within one particular, right, paradigm, you are mixing methods, right? And you are not mixing paradigms. So that is what it is. So I'm not saying use 1 or 2. Besides, I've not looked at your work. I don't know what you are doing, right? But if I had the opportunity of reading, certainly whether you are in agriculture or forestry or wherever it is, as long as you have framed your problem, I can tell because I will understand what you are researching, right? And by the way, one of the things you should note is that at the PhD level, right, knowledge starts converging. It doesn't matter whether you are in medicine, you're public health, you are in engineering, you start dealing with the problems that confront society. So there's nothing you are going to do that I do not understand. Unless you pick the blood and you start testing the blood and talk about those philosophical elements of blood, there I will not follow. But as long as your work is behavioral, wherever you pick it, there is a convergence of knowledge, whether you're in economics, right, or engineering. Right, I hope that answers your question, Raphael. Does it? Okay, now let me go to this. There are 3 questions in the chat room. One is from Isaac Okwara, right? Thaddeus is simply saying no question. Thaddeus Okwara is saying what informs the number of theories in a research problem? This one I've already answered it, right? And I've been talking about it every now. Can you mix macro and micro theories? Miami philosophical study? Thank you. Right, again, this is someone who has not been attending, right? And Rashid is asking, is a researcher supposed to draw all constructs in independent and dependent variables from more than one theory? Even this one is still the same question, actually, more or less. So let me begin with Isaac Okwara's question. What informs the number of theories in a research program? Right. I have always said, and let me say it, there is no universally prescribed number of theories that a researcher must use. There's no literature. Right. However, the number of theories is determined by the nature of the research problem. That's why I've been laboring, giving you the research problem or problem from scientific progress of knowledge. Karl Popper, if you're using Karl Popper, how do you frame the problem? right? Thomas Kuhn, how do you frame the problem? Imran Lactose, how do you? Loudon, how do you? So the number of theories is determined by the nature of the problem. The more complex the phenomenon under investigation is, and the more explanatory power that is required to understand that particular phenomenon, the more you increase the number of theories that you are using, right? But a theory should never be included merely to increase theoretical sophistication because you want to sound sophisticated. Every theory included in your work must contribute uniquely to explaining the research problem, to predicting the research problem, or probably understanding and interpreting the research problem. So generally, the number of theories is informed by one, complexity of the problem. Number two, explanatory gaps in a single theory. That means you have actually reviewed the theory and you have identified the gaps within those particular theories. Let me give you an example, right? If you want to use the theory of planned behavior, right, you'll find that the theory of planned behavior explains intentions, but inadequately explains the structural barriers. So you bring out the other aspects, but the structural barriers in this case will be brought up by another theory that you actually must use. So explanatory gaps in a single theory is the second one. The third one is the level of analysis. Whether your research involves individual level factors or organizational level factors or societal level factors. If your problem is at the individual level factors, you cannot begin combining theories anyhow. Like the one who has been explaining about forests, right? I would want to know what those theories were constructed to explain. Because you may find that some of them explain certain things, right? But you will not be able to combine. For example, if your problem has individual, right? And it has organizational, and it has societal factors, the way I somehow more or less felt when this gentleman was speaking, that it says some are individuals. You know, these forests are owned by individuals. You know, the other forests are by government. And then he had so many things there, meaning that he has a fairly sophisticated problem to bring out individual factors, organizational factors, or institutional factors, or national factors and societal factors. So one theory in this case may not adequately explain all levels. So it is only that theory that explains those things. Then the fourth element you should consider is philosophical orientation, right? If you are going to use interpretivist, and that's the one I've been explaining in the last few minutes, interpretivist studies often use fewer theories and allow theory to emerge from participants' meanings. Excuse me. So we don't expect you to begin mixing theories, right? Because interpretivist theories, interpretivist studies do not encourage you to use, but they encourage you to develop theories from the meanings that you pick from the field, right? So that is what it is. So for me, at this level, this should be a doctoral principle, right? The correct question is not how many theories should I use. The correct question is how many theories are necessary to adequately explain my research problem. And remember, throughout these lectures, I'm looking at framing the statement of the problem. I'm not even talking about the introduction or literature review or conceptual framework. I'm looking at the problem, the research problem. Isaac Okwara added a second question. Can you mix macro and micro theories in your philosophical study? The answer is yes. In fact, many contemporary doctoral studies benefit from integrating those macro and micro level theories because social phenomenon often operates simultaneously at multiple levels. It is very hard for you to see a phenomenon, social phenomenon operating only at micro without bringing the macro level and vice versa. So the key issue is not whether they are macro or micro theories. The key issue is whether they are philosophically compatible and whether they collectively explain the research problem. Again, it takes us back to the research problem. So I would imagine that the micro level theories you are talking about will include focusing on individuals' behavior, cognition, perception, decision-making, right? Like the theory of planned behavior, social cognitive theory, career construction theory, self-efficacy theory, things like that. Now, macro theories, right? I would imagine that here, these ones focus on institutions, on systems, on structures, on culture, society. And of course, here you can have institutional theory, the structuration theory, political economy theory, social practice theory, etc., etc. Right. So, depending on your problem, you can actually mix the two. So let's imagine that you are studying graduate employability in a low-resource context, for example. Right. You might combine what we call micro-level. Micro-level theory here, you can have career construction theory. Right, where you deal with the issues of adaptability, you deal with the issues of career identity, you deal with the issues of career agency. These are at the micro level. But at the macro level, yeah, you cannot ignore, for example, human capital theory. Right, because human capital theory is a macro theory because it explains what we call labor market expectations. Right, it will explain the skill investments. It will explain the economic value of education, right? So, of course, if you bring in human capital theory, yes, it will do that. And also institutional theory. Institutional theory will explain university systems, right? Labor market institutions, employer expectations, and things like that, right? So, if your topic, right, requires you to operate at different levels here, you'll have both macro and micro theories combined. So theories should not simply be stacked together. The researcher must explain why each theory is needed, what aspect of the problem it explains, right? How the theories relate to each other, and whether they are philosophically compatible. And this is especially important at the PhD level. So I think that answers that question. I can see another question here, and that will be the last question. Rashid Musa. Rashid Musa is asking a question. Is a researcher supposed to draw all constructs in independent and dependent variables from only one theory? Rashid, if I was given 1 second to answer, I would only say no and stop there. Right. So, but I'm saying no. And again, I'm going to qualify that statement so that tomorrow, when your supervisor, the doctoral committee tells you, we don't see where these variables are coming from. You don't say, but you know, this man called Intai told me this. At least you have an explanation. It's not simply saying no. So I know that a common misconception among doctoral students that all constructs must come from a single theory. Right, and to me, that's a common misunderstanding. Remember, we have been dealing with statement of the problem. Now, this element here, right, that misconception that I'm talking about, that all constructs must come from a single theory, right, can be justified methodologically, right? And to me, this is not a methodological requirement. So what matters, Rashid, one is theoretical justification. Every construct included in a study should have a clear theoretical rationale, right? The constructs may come from one theory, two theories, or several complementary theories, provided their inclusion is logically justified. Right. So let me give you an example. Suppose you're a researcher and you want to use the technology acceptance model. Right. The independent variables are perceived usefulness, perceived ease of use. The dependent variable is technology adoption. So when we look at this, all constructs emerge from one theory. And this is perfectly acceptable. Right. Let's look at multiple theories. I actually gave you an example a few minutes ago. You are studying employability. So supposing in your, independent variables, you have constructs like career, adaptability, you have lifelong learning. Of course, career adaptability comes from career construction theory, but you must understand it very well so that you do not attribute constructs of career adaptability to another theory of lifelong learning if that is what you want to bring in there. So if your dependent variable is employability, and you have picked this from other theories like career construction theory, human capital theory, or social capital theory. So in this case, the constructs are coming from different theories. So this is also perfectly acceptable if properly justified. So when you hear the examiners and doctoral committee members asking a question, why did you use 3 theories? Don't you think one theory would have sufficed? It's because in their view, after interrogating that particular theory, they see that all these constructs you have in a conceptual model actually come from one theory. So the other theories that you have in your work are just simply decorative. They don't say much. So a strong doctoral study is not judged by the number of theories used. It is judged by the clarity of the research problem, the theoretical relevance of the chosen theories, the logical relationships among those constructs, the coherence between philosophy, theory, methodology, and methods, and the extent to which the theories help explain the phenomenon under investigation. So you must remember at some stage that these theories you are using, or theory in this case you are using, should serve the research problem. The research problem should not be forced to serve the theory. So don't begin with the failure to understand the problem, and then you simply list down the theories, and at the end of the day, you are going to alter aspects of the research problem so that they suit the theories that you are using. Right. So my friend Rashida, I know you have another question there, but allow me not to answer that question, because I believe that the answer I've given in one way or the other answers your problem, your question there.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Prof. You've adequately justified.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to stop here and we close our session. Next time we should go to another aspect. I'll send you a link, right, so that we meet and then continue with the crafting the statement of the problem, right? Crafting the statement of the problem. But around this time now, looking at those particular perspectives that must actually
thank you, Prof.
Guide the crafting of the research problem. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending this session.
Thank you, Prof.
It
You've
has
really
been nice
helped us.
having you, and I wish you a nice time Enjoy your weekend and bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Prof.
Prof.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, Prof.
Very insightful, very encouraging.
Thank you, Professor.